the fact that it continues to use the Russian youth as cannon fodder on the front create a great dilemma for the Russian people. The Russian people are choosing between emigration or protesting on the streets of Russia against the Putin regime and its war policies. In fact, both are a rebellion against the Putin regime. Especially in the Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk regions on the western border of Russia, Russian citizens are leaving their homes. Even the Russian people in the Crimea and Krasnodar are fleeing into the depths of Russia. Massive protests now shake the Kremlin in major Russian cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan. While the streets of Moscow are boiling like a witch's cauldron, the Russian army is once again working to inflict a heavy mobilization blow on the Russian people. At the first stage of the war, the first feeling of the Russian people was the feeling of bewilderment, because there was both historical and cultural unity between Russia and Ukraine. That's why the Russians considered the Ukrainian people close to them. When the Russians got over the first surprise, the second stage stepped in. And at this stage, the Russians started to support the war with the statements of the Russian leader and the propaganda activities of the state television. Even in this process, support for Vladimir Putin has increased considerably. However, with the Russian leader's declaration of partial mobilization last fall, the Russian people moved to the third phase. At this stage, the Russian people's perspective on the Ukraine war and Putin began to change. With the declaration of mobilization, the Russians realized that the war began to affect them in every way. Russia's move to send hundreds of thousands to fight on Ukrainian battlefields prompted many Russians to flee the country. The war had now penetrated into Russian homes. After the declaration of mobilization, tension and anxiety prevailed in the Russian people. This concern gave way to protests and rebellion over time. A group of Russian wives and mothers urged President Vladimir Putin to stop sending their husbands and sons to slaughter by forcing them to join assault groups without adequate training or supplies. In a video shared by independent Russian Telegram channel Sota, the woman said that her loved ones were forced to join assault groups in early March, despite having only received 4 days of training since their mobilization in September. Families of the enlisted Russian men criticized the mobilization, saying that it was beset by disciplinary issues and logistical challenges, such as middle-ranking officers' lack of leadership, non-existent training and inadequate uniforms, poor food, and medical equipment. On the other hand, Russian women are paying the price for the protests against Putin's war. According to the data, women make up the majority of those detained in Russia's protests against President Vladimir Putin's mobilization for the war in Ukraine. Many Russian men are afraid of being sent to the front if they demonstrate. Court documents also show that more women were blamed for the anti-war protests in February and March in Moscow during the first weeks of the conflict than for the anti-Putin protests in previous years. Ella Rossman, also a researcher at University College London School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies, attributed the increase in women's share of protests to fears of some conscripts and a growing Russian feminist movement. By mapping Russian feminist activism, Rossman increased the number of Russian feminist groups from around 30 in 2019 to 45 in 2021. Women did not just protest the war in the streets. Shortly after the conflict began, Rossman, along with other activists, founded a movement called Feminist Anti-War Resistance. Stating that its members were posting about the war on social media and distributing a newspaper in Russia, the minister added that they wrote anti-war slogans on ruble banknotes and price tags in stores. Russian people began to unite against Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. The fire of rebellion within the Russians had ignited at once. This fire would not stop until the Russian leader was burned. The protests led by especially Russian women increased day by day. The last of these protest movements was the flower protests. Let's get to know the flower protests better. As it is known, one of the deadliest events of the occupation of Moscow took place in the city of Dnipro last month. Dozens of Ukrainians were killed in the Russian missile attack. Officials and pro-Kremlin commentators suggested that Ukraine's air defenses caused the explosion, while Russia denied carrying out the attack. In the wake of the January 14th attack in Dnipro were a shocking reminder of the devastation caused by the Ukrainian war and sparked anger and embarrassment among some Russians. After this attack, Russians continue to commemorate those who lost their lives in what has turned into a new form of anti-war protests across the country. The ongoing commemorations for the victims of the Dnipro attack are the first nationwide anti-war protests since the demonstrations against the country's partial mobilization in September. In at least 60 cities across Russia, often statues of Ukrainian poets Taras Shevchenko and Lesya Ukrainka, or memorials to victims of Soviet-era political repression, are adorned by Russians with makeshift flowers, stuffed toys, and handwritten notes. A woman laying flowers at a memorial service in Novosibirsk, Siberia, said that this is not just a mourning for those who died in Dnipro, but a declaration against war. A man from the Khanty-Mansisk Autonomous Region said, "To show that all Russians are not merciless towards Ukrainians, I decided to lay flowers at a local monument," he said, leaving a flower in his hand. It was also reported that local residents left yellow roses with blue and yellow ribbons, the colors of the Ukrainian flag, in the southern Russian city of Krasnodar. In the Volga River city of Kazan, there are photos of the destroyed Dnipro apartment building and a sign next to a monument to the victims of political repression that reads, "Kazan is in mourning." The monument in the city of Vladikavkaz in the North Caucasus consisted of a handful of red carnations and a child's toy. In Pskov, Western Russia, people laid flowers and lit candles at a monument dedicated to mothers and children. Russia's POX protesters, on the other hand, have not faced the same level of police repression faced by anti-war Russians who took to the streets in the immediate aftermath of last year's invasion and following President Vladimir Putin's September mobilization order. However, at least 7 people were reportedly detained. Yekaterina Verenik, 26, was sentenced to 12 days in prison last month for ignoring police orders while holding a banner reading, "Ukraine is not our enemy," next to a monument in central Moscow. This is not the first time such commemorations have been seen in Russia, where flowers were left at the Ukrainian embassy and other places in Moscow after the invasion last year. A temporary flower and a photo memorial for opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated on a bridge near the Kremlin in 2015, has since become a permanent fixture maintained by his supporters. However, the response to the Dnipro attack has become much more widespread and shows no signs of ending. In another development, the Russian government is trying to hide not only the massive losses in the war, but also the problems facing the mobilized people. The social network VKontakte, owned by Gazprom, removes posts with complaints. In particular, it was learned that a post on Kaliningrad suicide attacks and complaints about suicide that motivated colleagues was deleted. No matter how hard the Kremlin administration tries to hide it, the anger inside the Russian people is growing day by day. Increasing riots and protests show that anger is erupting. The Russian people are in a rage. The decrease in trust and support of the Russian people for Vladimir Putin is about to disturb the calm of Russian cities. We see how much the Ukrainian war has affected the Russian people. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and like our videos. Thank you for watching us.